Hey there again, welcome back. We're going to finish talking about study participants with talking about retention. So in the last lecture we talked about how do you find them, how hard is it to find them, where do you find all that kind of stuff, how do you compensate them. Now we're going to talk about they're on the study, how do you retain them. So the first question is, why do people enroll in trials? Which is a really good question. There are lots of reasons. One of it is the compensation. Remember, I said that's always my first question. If I'm going to give you my time, what are you going to give me in return? Compensation is really important. And it depends on what you're on in your life. College students, right? I remember being very broke. Compensation was much more important to me then than it is now. So it might also be looking at health care or getting good health information. So if I am going to participate in a clinical trial, that's going to give me access to an investigator who is a physician likely. And so I'm going to be able to get health care that maybe I don't have insurance for. So for some people, this is really important. Also, sometimes it is getting information about my disease that's important. So people will have individual needs for access to health care. Some people say the risk relative to benefit is important to them. So people will look and say, I want to make sure my risks are lower than possible benefit. And so people will look at that too. So if I'm enrolling on an acne trial, there are treatments for acne out there, and I want to know the risks are pretty light because the benefit is going to be an improved complexion. So if the risks are really high, I'm going to say no, thank you. On the other hand, if I have a terminal illness like cancer, I might be willing to absorb more risks in order to gain benefit, right? So this is an important consideration for people who are looking at enrolling in a trial. Convenience, so that's the next thing. So the compensation might be good, but if I have to go every morning to get blood work done, I might think, nah, it's just going to be a pain in the neck. So how convenient is it for me? And then there are some people that really do report enrolling in clinical trials for altruistic benefits. So sometimes people will say, I might not get any benefit out of this, but this might be good for someone else with this disease. So some people are really, truly selfless in their desire to enroll in clinical trial. So enrolling in a clinical trial, let's talk about some of the reasons why someone might discontinue early. Remember, I said in my example in the last lecture was a participant has to stay on study for 2 months. That was my example. Remember, your protocol will tell you how long they have to be on the study in order to generate enough data to be considered valuable. So some reasons I might be for early discontinuation is medical necessity. Sponsor might initiate early discontinuation. And then you could have someone cut off study early because they're non-compliant. And we're going to talk about each of those sort of in some detail. So let's talk about medical necessity. Sometimes participants will have adverse events or serious adverse events. We'll talk about serious adverse events soon here that make it important that they not be on the study anymore. So if the side effect is really severe, it might be in the best interest of that individual's health to not participate in the study any longer. So that might be a medical reason to take them off the study, so to discontinue them early. A lack of efficacy. So if we find out at the 2-month time mark, we're going to check and see whether that person's disease is better. If it's getting worse, we don't want to keep them on the study anymore because there's no sense in it. If the disease is stable or getting better, then we would keep them on the study longer. So the lack of efficacy. A pregnancy will usually be a medical reason to discontinue someone from a clinical trial. Unless a pregnancy is being pregnant is part of the inclusion criteria to be in the study. But typically we find that sponsors do not want to expose an unborn child to potential adverse events of a drug that's not fully understood. So this makes sense that if someone shows up pregnant while in a study, we'll take them off the study. That being said, there's a lot, depending again on the drug, there's usually a lot of information that's given to someone about why avoiding pregnancy is important. But people still do surprisingly, show up pregnant. Sometimes someone will be enrolled in a study and then found later to be ineligible. Every protocol is going to have a list of inclusion criteria all the things we want in a participant, and exclusion criteria, all the things we don't want the participant to have. So sometimes that patient might be eligible because they meet all the inclusion criteria, but there might be an exclusion criteria that's not correctly assessed. And so later on that person will be found to be ineligible. And so some of the ways you can sort of, solution for this is to just be very, very careful, and a lot of scrutiny and a lot of time in the screening process. Now, you really can't do anything about the adverse events or the serious adverse events or the lack of efficacy. That's related to the drug. But you can do a lot, again, to help people not become pregnant on the trial, so a lot of education, and then screening people thoroughly and correctly to make sure that they are totally eligible to be in the study. So medically speaking, these are some of the reasons why you could have someone be removed from the study prematurely. So let's talk about sponsor-initiated. The sponsor might have safety concerns, not just at your site, but at other sites that the sponsor might say, we might be stopping the trial early, or if nothing else, maybe having a pause where they're going to take everybody off the trial and analyze the data a little more carefully. But anytime there's a safety concern and that the risk has suddenly had a big increase, the sponsor might say, enough, everybody's off. Lack of efficacy, I mentioned that for the individual patient, but the sponsor might say, look, we have looked at some of the data across many different research sites, and we are finding that this drug doesn't work across the board for a lot of people. And the efficacy is so bad that we will never get this approved by the FDA. Along those lines, efficacy and safety, right, are always those two primary concerns, but you might also find that the sponsor says this is no longer meeting our corporate objectives. So that might be more of a business assessment. The sponsor might discontinue a patient for those reasons, but they might also discontinue your site if you fail to enroll at a reasonable rate. And so this is sort of back to that reason why recruitment is so important. But if you don't put patients on the study, they're not going to want to put any energy into you. So they might say, look, you haven't enrolled any patients, we're going to cancel the study with you. Failure of the site to follow good clinical practice and all the Code of Federal regulations. If you are non-compliant with regulatory requirements, they are going to want to close you, because the FDA considers the sponsor responsible for you doing the good job. So this is important to consider. The first two ones, the safety and lack of efficacy, you can't really do anything about that. But you can, failure of site to enroll and failure of your site to be compliant to regulations are important, and you can affect those. So what you're going to do in order, a solution for this is you're going to be one of the first sites to enroll if possible. Now, if your site has been added sort of late in the game, that's okay. You can still make up for it, but you have to be very interested and cognizant of recruitment, and then you have to be really knowledgeable about the regulations, which is why you're taking these classes, so you can know and follow the regulations as opposed to finding them out through trial and error. So you can do some things about sponsor initiated discontinuation. Let's talk about non-compliance too. Non-compliance in this situation is the failure of the participant to follow the study procedures. The protocol says exactly what the study procedures are going to be, and you expect your participants to follow them with your assistance. So some causes of non-compliance can be a confusing schedule of appointments. The more complex the study is, the more likely the participant's not going to be able to keep up with things. So if you have a very confusing schedule of appointments, or very complex schedule of appointments, that is a scenario in which it's not unreasonable for you to find that participants are having trouble. Scheduling them at inconvenient times or an inconvenient schedule. If you have a participant that works full-time, scheduling them to come in and be seen at 2 in the afternoon might be really impossible for them, and they might not do it. They might choose staying at work over coming to do that appointment. So you have to look at those whenever possible, the schedule and the times of appointments at times that work for them. I remember one time I had a participant who I didn't schedule their appointments. We had a scheduler. The participant did not get a CT scan done, and she was scheduled for a CT scan at 7 a.m., but she took the bus everywhere, and there was no way she could get a bus to get to her location for a 7 a.m. appointment. Transportation issues, sort of back to that last example, right? She had to take the bus and she had to transfer twice to get to where she was going. Transportation issues can be huge, and they might be permanent transportation issues. You could have a transportation issue just like my car broke down and was in the shop for a whole week. So you have to be aware of those kinds of things, because transportation is obviously essential to being able to keep appointments. Communication and or cultural barriers, and we've all been in this situation where right now, for example, I think I'm communicating very clearly, but you might have a lot of questions about what I just said. So there can be just basic issues where there's miscommunication. There can be cultural barriers too that prevent people from being compliant. So you have to sort of think very closely about these things. I will tell you that I think most people that participate in clinical research really want to do a good job, and they want to follow those procedures as well as they can. So you have to really look at the causes of what could be getting in the way. What kind of barriers are they finding? And then unpleasant adverse events. Okay, so a good example is an oral drug and the person gets a rash, like a bad, like acne kind of rash. That participant might stop taking the study drug the week before her daughter's wedding, right? And I totally would understand why she might do that. So you have to look at what the adverse events are like and how they impact that person's life. So how do you prevent non-compliance? And there are some things you can do to make your patients more compliant. Again, I like to go on the basis of positive intent, where I really do believe that most study participants try to do a very good job. So here's how you can help them to be very good at that. You can send reminders to them. It could be a mail reminder, because oftentimes they'll leave and you'll say, here's your next appointment, here's when you have to get a CT scan. And maybe more than one reminder is necessary, so popping something in the mail can be really good. Calling to remind people is always helpful. I love reminders. Emailing them, and this again, you're going to be very careful with HIPAA. You're not going to put anything in there that is protected health information, but you could say to your person, would you like me to text you? Would you like me to email you? Would you like the phone call? Everyone's different, and those reminders will be impactful in the way that's best for them. Use written as well as verbal instructions. This is why I record my lectures, but there's also these slides, right? So everyone's different in how they learn. Some people are great with verbal instructions. I suspect, and my position is that you really need to do both, because for certain disease types, especially terminal illnesses, this can be very stressful. Health deviations can be very stressful for individuals. So even though they're looking at you and shaking their head and they're saying, yes, I understand, and yes, I can do that, when they leave, they might forget because of the stressful situation. So giving people written instructions as well as verbal instructions is really going to raise the likelihood that they're going to be compliant. And make sure you have a positive relationship between the participant and the staff, whoever that might be. It might be you, it might be someone who does scheduling. Participants, you want the participant to be able to call and say, I don't understand these instructions. You want to have that very positive, good relationship so they can call and say, you wrote it down for me, but I don't understand this. If you don't have a good relationship, they're not going to call, and they're not going to reach out, and they're not going to ask for clarification. And again, I sort of mentioned interactions tailored to provide patient satisfaction. So for me, I love emails. My husband, not so much. So I would say email me. He would definitely say, give me a phone reminder. So ask what works for them, and that will help with preventing noncompliance. And these are just common sense things. You could probably think of 5 other things that could be done that would make it easier for your participants. So I have a scenario here for you. Your patient, Mr. N, somewhat erratic with his study participation. After missing 2 appointments, a talk with a PI regarding the importance of his visits caused a positive change in his attitude. So now he gets it. Now a month later, he's called to say he cannot make any more of his appointments in person, but would instead like to call and discuss his health over the phone at the time of his regularly scheduled visits. What do you do? You're going to have these kinds of questions that come up while you do this job. So there's all sorts of questions I have here about Mr. N. It appears that talking to the PI sort of got him to understand, yes, and he started becoming compliant, and now he doesn't want to come in for his visits. The first thing I'm going to ask, I'm going to start asking some questions, open-ended questions, to try to figure out why he can't come in. Part of, and also I would look at my protocol to see, is this possible? Can I do a phone interview with him, or does he actually need to come in and have a physical exam? It's likely he probably needs to come in and have a physical exam, so the protocol is probably not going to allow for this. But let's say the protocol does allow for this. My next question is going to say, which is unlikely, but my next question is going to be, why can't you come in? I want to know, is he perhaps having an adverse event that he doesn't want to share with us? Perhaps he finds this intimately embarrassing adverse event. Maybe he has transportation issues, right? There are a host of things that could be going on here that would prevent him from coming in. But I would definitely want to get to the bottom of those and figure it out. At the very end of the day, if he just will not come back and you cannot perform a phone interview per your protocol, then he's probably going to have to come off the study. But you're going to have to do some talking and some investigating to sort of get to the bottom of it. And by the way, you're going to document everything that you do. So after you have this discussion with him, you're going to have a note to file about it. Another scenario, you have a patient, Mrs. G, and she comes to each patient, every visit, on time, very friendly, really reliable, great woman. Overall, she appears engaged in the study. In spite of this, she consistently fails to complete her daily pain diary and often reports forgetting it at home or leaving on the bus. What do you do? Now, the daily pain diary, I'm assuming in this scenario, is required by protocol. Every day she's going to assess her pain. But she doesn't bring it with her to her study appointments, and this is going to be providing data for the trial. If she continues to do this, then she's not generating the data that's necessary, and she might not be valuable. The sponsor might say you have to take her off the study. But before we get to such drastic responses, right, I want to figure out what's going on with her. Now I'm going to call her and I'm going to talk to her. Or maybe I'll do it when she comes to her appointment. So everybody forgets something sometimes, right? So she forgets it once, I'll say, please bring it with you at your next appointment. Or maybe I'll ask her to mail it to me and I'll give her a stamped envelope. But if this is a repetitive thing and it's happening reliably, I want to know, is she really forgetful? Would her family attest to the fact that she fills it out every day? Maybe I need to give her a reminder the day before her appointment. Call and tell her, put your daily pain diary in your purse now so you don't forget it. So that might be the problem. She might have trouble reading, right? We don't really know anything about whether she is literate. So she might have trouble actually doing the pain diary. Maybe she has really bad arthritis and she can't fill in her pain diary and she's too embarrassed to admit that to you. So this might be after some discussion finding out that her arthritis is really bothering her and it's difficult to fill out the diary, and then you say, well, that's okay. Have your daughter or your husband help you. So there are lots of options here, but you have to always get at the root of what's going on to help that person be compliant. Because again, with positive intent, I'm assuming she wants to be compliant, and it seems like that's the case. So I would definitely get to the bottom of it, the issue. So now let's assume that you actually have non-compliance and you need to address it. So let's talk about what I should do when I find someone who's really non-compliant. I'm going to talk to the participant like in my scenarios. That is the first, easiest, fastest way to figure out what's going on. I'm going to then help them find some solutions to whatever's going on there. I might need to notify my sponsor. Now, if I can find a nice solution like calling her to remind her to put the diary in her purse, or having her husband help her fill it out, that does not need to go to the sponsor. But if I have someone who is consistently non-compliant and I cannot get them to be compliant, I'm going to want to notify the sponsor. The sponsor, in a discussion with me and my investigator, might say, we're going to withdraw that person from the study. And you're going to always document these events, right? Either in a note to, usually in a note to file in this kind of situation. All right, let's have another one. You have a patient, Mrs. M, who's not shown up today for her 3-month visit. She completed all the other study visits without a problem during the first and the second month, so now you're a little surprised. So you call her phone number listed in the medical record and you find it's been disconnected. Okay, now what do? Well, you don't say, well, I tried. You're gonna sort of turn over a lot of stones trying to find Mrs. M, and for a lot of different reasons. So here's what happens when you find someone who's lost follow-up. And if she had a 3-month follow-up visit, and she probably might have a 6-month follow-up visit, how do you find these non-responders? In her medical record is a phone number that's been discontinued. So then there's almost always an authorized contact, right? The next of kin usually. So I'm going to contact that authorized person and say, I'm looking for Mrs. M. I'm Heather. I'm looking for Mrs. M, right? And so they might say, oh yeah, she has a new phone number. That would be super nice and easy. Or they might tell you that she was in the hospital. In that case, that might be really important, as she might have had a serious adverse event, which we'll talk about in another lecture. So you want to know, and the authorized contact might be helpful. The authorized contact, let's say they have a discontinued number too. So now I'm going to call the referring physician if there is one. So if a physician from another practice referred Mrs. M to us for the trial, I'm going to contact that physician and say, has Mrs. M been in for a visit with you? So that's good. I'm sort of figuring out where she is. My billing office can often also help. Billing offices are like little detective agencies. Because practices do not want to get unpaid, billing offices are really very clever, and they have lots of little tricks up their sleeves to finding people that you might have never considered, because you might not be looking as hard as they are. You can also use the internet, right? You don't have to tell me, you don't have to admit, but everybody's looked for an old flame on the internet, right? The internet, you can find people. Now, Mrs. M might be hard to find on the internet. If her name is Mary Smith, that might be a very hard to find, but sometimes you can find people using the internet and social media and things like that. And then you might want to send a letter to Mrs. M. You're going to have a mailing address for Mrs. M, and you're going to send a letter, because with all of these other things, if none of them are working and you have not been able to identify where Mrs. M is, now you're going to send a letter to her address, and you're going to send a certified return receipt letter. You might send a letter and say, you didn't come for your 3-month visit, please contact us and reschedule this appointment. And she might just think, I'm not doing that. I don't want to see those people anymore, forget it, I'm not doing it. In that case, at least you have a return receipt that someone signed for it. So you can show the sponsor that you've really turned over a lot of stones and you've really looked hard to find this patient. Worst case scenario, and this is only used in very long longitudinal studies that are going to last for years and years and years, a professional patient locator agency. Again, these are expensive. Do not pay for this yourself. Negotiate this with your sponsor. But if they want to find out how someone's doing 5 years after or 10 years after they were in a study, you know how oftentimes people move and change phones in 5 or 10 years? You might want to consider using an agency, because they really know how to find people that will blow your mind, and it's things you don't have the time to do. So you might want to do that. But above all else, you're going to document everything you've done, so you can really say, yes, I have done everything I could to find this patient. I'm going to document the heck out of this, because I want the sponsor to know that I'm really good at my job and I have done everything reasonable to find a participant. All right, so last scenario. Your site successfully completed a trial sponsored by Novartis 3 years ago. You don't even remember doing it. 3 years have passed. You're surprised to receive a phone call today from the Novartis project manager requesting additional long-term safety information from the associated participants. You are asked to mail each participant a questionnaire regarding long-term events. What do you do? Now, that was 3 years ago. I'm assuming we closed the trial, they had a closeout visit, and everything else today. Now, this might be a very reasonable request from Novartis. Maybe they are finding that there are long-term latent adverse events that happen to people after participating in a trial, maybe years later, they're starting to find some adverse events. So this might be really grounded in a very reasonable scientific question, right? I would say a couple of things here. The first question I have was, those participants, when they signed the consent form, did the consent form say, we will contact you 3, 4, 5 years later? It unlikely did. This sounds like this is all new and emerging. So if the consent form didn't say, I agree to be contacted in the future, I think that these participants, and this is data that's going to be collected systematically for use in a new drug application, then I think those participants need to be asked to sign a new consent form saying they agree to undergo a questionnaire. Okay, so that's the first thing. Did they consent? And if not, we have to have them consent. The second question is, what are they going to do with this? How is this data going to be collected? Are there going to be case report forms necessary for this? It almost sounds like Novartis is creating a little mini study on the end of that trial you did 3 years ago. And so I think all of these things could be done, but they're not going to be done for free. So I'm going to talk to that Novartis project manager about an IRB submission, about the data collection, about paying me for all that work. And so this is sort of like a little mini study, and I would start it from the point of the consent form and work backwards into, we need to talk about a contract for this if you're going to have me collect data for you. So the project manager will probably tell you, okay, let me think about it and talk to my boss. And Novartis may or may not want to proceed, but you're not going to do anything of this nature without ensuring that you're getting your financial compensation and that the participants are being safeguarded. Okay, that's sort of an unusual scenario. So again, Karen Wood's our reference. Where would we be without good old Karen Wood? Contact me, email me, Skype me, whatever works best for you if you have any questions. Otherwise, take care. I'll talk to you soon.